Have you ever heard the true story of the serial killer couple who would roam the streets at night, hunting for their perfect victim? Their unholy alliance would lead to the deaths of 12 people and the sexual assault of numerous underage girls. Between 1987 and 2003, the killers would operate with impunity, without worrying that they'd ever be caught. This is the terrifying tale of murderers Michel Fourniret and his wife Monique Olivier, and the trail of blood they left in their wake. First things first, guys, let's get a little bit of context into the type of man that Michel was. Basically, Michel Fourniret had a really sick and disturbing obsession with virginity, and a depraved desire to rob it from any young girl who happened to be unlucky enough to cross his path. He had what could only be described as a rough childhood. His father was a metal worker, and his mother a homemaker. As a child, he was described as quiet and reflective, and enjoyed activities like playing chess and listening to classical music. As you can already tell, these are pretty harmless hobbies that were totally different from what he would later come to be known for as he grew into adulthood. In conversations he had when he was a bit older, Michel would claim that he had been sexually abused by his mother numerous times, and it would make a sense that his own loss of innocence could and would have impacted him psychologically. At the age of 12, Michel also claimed he had a vision of the Virgin Mary as he rode his bike one day. This probably also contributed to his fascination and obsession with the idea of a woman's purity. Maybe the idea of robbing or destroying purity gave him a sense of power. When he entered adulthood, he worked a series of menial jobs, such as being a forestry worker and at one point even a school supervisor. In 1966, he committed his first sexual assault. He was 24 years old and imprisoned for the crime of groping a minor. And while this crime was awful in itself, no one could be prepared for what was to come next. His real rampage would begin much later, after a period of quiet because of his 1984 imprisonment for sexually assaulting 5, yes, you heard me, 5 young girls. At this point, Michel was 42 years old, and he also attempted to kidnap a young woman at this time. But the horror does not stop there. He would go on to claim to have allegedly sexually assaulted 15 young girls in the Paris region. But he was never even prosecuted for this. I mean, was it even investigated? Because the numbers were crazy. How was it that this guy wasn't put behind bars earlier? I mean, surely authorities would recognize his potential to re-offend if his claims were to be true. Michel was sentenced to only 3 years in prison for the assaults. And you'd think he'd at least try and change his ways while locked up, but no. Instead, his desires only became more depraved. It was like he was hell-bent on fulfilling his fantasies no matter the cost. He began thinking about how he would carry out his plan for when he eventually got out. What he didn't know was that he would meet an accomplice, and she would later become his wife. A divorced mother of 2, Monique Olivier and Michel Fourniret began conversing through a pen pal program after Michel placed an ad in a Catholic magazine. And it was not his first romance. He had previously been married, but was horrified when he found out that his wife had not been a virgin when he married. It's also been suggested that Michel had an issue with his sexual performance, and virgins would not know or recognize that he wasn't necessarily skilled in the bedroom, which might be why he developed such an obsession with them. When corresponding with Monique, Michel did not hide his fantasies. He confessed that he wanted to go virgin hunting, to kidnap and rape young girls. In his letters to Monique, he would describe the girls he wanted to hunt as membranes on legs, and spoke of wanting to pierce them with what he called his rainbow. another term for his penis. He stated that by doing this, he would be a man like any other. Michel also admitted that he had a notebook or a collector's item. In it, he detailed every sexual assault and the personal details of every victim. And rather than being absolutely horrified, Monique agreed to help him in his mission to fulfill all of these sexual desires if he promised to murder her ex-husband. Michel agreed to this, but this would just be one of his broken promises. He would never kill Monique's ex. Nonetheless, Monique would continue to assist him. At that point, Monique was intensely lonely. To Michel, she displayed an emotional dependency and fear of abandonment. This was obviously a clear manipulation strategy for Michel, who convinced her that she was not alone. But Monique also saw a plan when it came to Michel. One for her own type of domination and the assurance that she would never be abandoned. Monique was just 38 years old when she began her relationship with Michel. Her 2 children had been taken from her custody, and she would go on to claim that her previous partner, a painter, would make her pose for hours on end, or else she would be forced to suffer cruel treatment at his hands. She claimed that he regularly beat her, tortured her by holding her head underwater, and would also pimp her out to other men. However, none of her claims could be proven, and her ex-husband denied all of these allegations. It seems that even then, Monique was intent on portraying herself as a victim, and Michel had become a source of attention, but also revenge. Monique's childhood could be described as lonely. She was born in Tours and moved to Nantes when she was 4. Monique's mother was an alcoholic, driven to drink because her husband lived a double life and had affairs without much consideration for who could find out. Monique also suffered from a stammer as a child, which made her feel isolated and somewhat different from her peers. In 1987, after months of correspondence, Michel, now aged 45, was released from prison, and Monique went to pick him up. Just 2 months after this, he would commit murder. He and Monique had moved to a remote town in Burgundy, which provided the perfect hunting ground for their new hobby. At that point, there was no system in place to trace sex offenders. There wasn't even a registry. None of Michel's neighbors knew about his dark desires. He was able to go on with his life, planning and plotting without any interference from those around him. When Michel decided to commit his first murder, he would use his white van as the means of abduction, driving around with Monique along winding roads, searching for potential victims, and this is literally my worst nightmare. I was always afraid of white vans growing up, and it's stories like this that make me remember why. So these two, together in December of 1987, spotted 17-year-old Isabelle Laville walking home from school near Auxerre. They followed her, noted her route, and concocted a plan to act within the next few days. On December 11th, Isabelle never came home from school. Her parents waited all night, hoping to hear her footsteps at the front door, but she would never return. That day, as she walked home, Monique and Michel traveled in separate vehicles. Monique pulled up behind Isabelle and asked her for directions. She then requested that the girl get into her car and show her the way. And Isabelle, out of kindness, agreed. And as the pair drove, Michel had parked his car further down the road and was standing beside it, pretending it had broken down. Monique pulled up next to him, and the pair pretended that they didn't know each other. After Michel told them that his car had broken down, Monique offered him a lift, sealing Isabelle's fate. In the car, Michel suddenly produced a piece of rope, which he used to strangle Isabelle, while Monique administered a dose of. Then, while Isabelle was incapacitated, they drove her back to their home in Saint-Cyr-les-Cologne, where Michel would rape her. But there was one problem. Michel struggled with impotence, and to rape Isabelle, he needed Monique to perform a sexual act on him. Monique, of course, agreed. After he raped Isabelle, he strangled her to death, and the pair dumped her body down a well in Bussy and Aude, where it would remain hidden for 18 years. In future rapes of his victims, he would force them to say, "Will you make love to me, monsieur?" or "Thank you, monsieur," phrases that Monique would repeat when the pair had sex to allow Michel to relive the experiences. After Isabelle, it would only be 3 months before Michel would kill again. In March, Michel was contacted by Farida Hamish, the wife of Michel's old cellmate, Jean-Pierre Helagorge, who was incarcerated for being a prolific bank robber associated with one of France's most famous gangs. Jean-Pierre had told Farida about a haul that was buried in a cemetery in Fontenay-en-Parisis, consisting of gold coins and ingots worth millions. Farida promised Michel that if he helped her dig it up, she would give him a share. And so, in the dead of night, Michel, Monique, and Farida dug up the trove, and Michel received a share worth $14,000. But that was not enough. One of the conditions of his union with Monique was that the pair would never again be poor. And with Michel's menial jobs, money was hard to come by. So they concocted a plan. In April, Monique and Michel managed to lure Farida out of her home and drove her to Clairefontaine and Yvelines. Then they strangled her and buried her, later breaking into her home and stealing anything worth selling, along with the small fortune she had found in the cemetery. Monique and Michel used the stolen funds to buy a chateau in Donchéry, which would later become a burial ground. Farida's body would never be found. By August, Monique was pregnant with Michel's child. But despite her pregnancy, it would not stop her nor Michel from carrying out their plans. In fact, it would help them. They lived an ordinary life from the outside. They conversed with neighbors, formed routines, and were gonna raise a child together. They filled the house with all the things they might need for an abduction, such as handcuffs, gags, masks for anesthetics, condoms, and a variety of weapons for any given situation that might come up. It only shows how brutal they both were. Yet neighbors would describe Monique as gentle and Michel as unassuming yet aggressive, often killing cats that came into his backyard. Monique would begin to use her pregnancy as a cover. Even before his birth, the couple would involve their son in their abductions. On August 3rd, Monique and Michel drove to a supermarket in Châlons-en-Champagne. There in the car park, they spotted a target, 20-year-old Fabienne Leroy. Monique pretended to be ill, and the couple asked Fabienne to assist them by helping to direct them to the nearest doctor's surgery. Fabienne agreed, however. Instead of following her directions, the couple drove her to a forest near a military camp. Michel knew that Monique's presence would provide a false sense of safety for the girls he abducted. Surely a pregnant woman and her husband would mean no harm. There in the forest, Michel instructed Monique to check if Fabienne's hymen was still intact, but she refused. Michel shrugged it off. He wasn't going to stop. Michel raped Fabienne before shooting her in the chest. It would not be the last time they would use their son Salim in a killing. He would often become an unwilling accessory to their evil plans. The couple would lure their victims with expertise, preying on their sense of security. And for 18 years, it worked. In January 1989, Michel met 21-year-old Jean-Marie Desramault on the evening train to Charleville-Mézières. She was staying at a nearby convent, and Michel managed to get her attention by assuming a false identity and making her think he and Monique were also religious. The couple met her at the train station again on March 18th and invited her to their home in Flowing. Michel promised to drive her home afterward. When they arrived at the home, Michel asked her if she was a virgin. Jean said no, she wasn't, and enraged, Michel attacked her. He tried to rape her, but she fought back. Monique held her down while Michael bound her with adhesive bandages and gagged her. Then he strangled her and buried her body in the garden of the chateau in Donchery, the Chateau du Satao, their very own house of horrors, concealing the dead with 37 acres of vast forest. In July 1989, Monique and Michel married. For a few months, there was a period of calm, until December 20th, when they drove to Namur with their son Salim. There, Michel spotted 12-year-old Elizabeth Brichet, who was walking to her friend's home, which was close to her house. He waited outside until she came back outside again at 7 p.m. The couple pretended Salim was sick and asked Elizabeth to give them directions to the doctor. Elizabeth dutifully got into the car and the couple drove her to Flowing. There, they tied Elizabeth to the bed and undressed her. Michel noticed that she was menstruating and ordered Monique to clean her genitals, which she did. Then, he raped Elizabeth and the next day strangled her at the chateau. He buried her in the garden, using his excavator, which he affectionately referred to as Dino. The couple would also use what they referred to as the au pair technique. They would lure girls into the home using Salim. Numerous au pairs were believed to have been hired for Salim. One in particular, who would remain unidentified, met her end in the home. One night, Michel went into the au pair's room. Monique would hear screaming and crying, and from that day on, she never saw that au pair again. Despite searches in later years, her body was never recovered. She was believed to have been between 15 and 17 years old, and a similar plot was used for the murder of Joanna Parrish in May 1990. Joanna was offering English lessons to children in Auxerre. Witnesses saw her in the town square with an unidentified man before her disappearance. Later, her body would be found abandoned in the river. She'd been raped and fluid was found on her corpse during the autopsy. Monique would later admit that she and Michel drove Joanna to the riverbank. Michel hit her over the head while Monique sat in the front seat of the car. She listened to Joanna screaming and the sounds of Michel beating her and strangling her to death. But Monique was unmoved. It was simply another day for her and Michel. On November 21st, the couple would commit their final murder together on the western coast of France. They spotted their next victim in a shopping center in Reims after attending a court case for burglary charges in Nantes. 13-year-old Natasha Danai was walking through the car park to fetch her mother's purse from her home. The couple lured her into the van, once again asking her for directions. They drove her to a secluded area, and Michel stabbed her twice in the chest with a screwdriver. Then he strangled her and abandoned her body on the beach. Of course, he didn't leave without taking a trophy, raping the girl's corpse after she was dead. Now, at the time, there were very few leads, and Natasha's neighbor was suspected of being involved. Jean Groy was falsely accused as his van matched the description of Michel's. He would later commit suicide in his cell, unable to cope with these allegations set against him. After Natasha's murder, Michel felt emboldened enough to commit his crimes alone. In the early 1990s, Michel, Monique, and Salim moved to Sartcoustine-Jardin in Belgium. Between 2000 and 2001, Michel committed 2 more murders, having allegedly abstained from his twisted desires for over 9 years. On May 16, 2000, Michel drove across the Franco-Belgian border to Charleville-Mézières. 18-year-old Céline Saison was on her way home from school. Somehow, probably using his usual tactics, he managed to convince her to enter his van. He then drove her back to his home where Monique was waiting. He raped Céline, then strangled her with a rope before dumping her body in a forest in Sugny. Her remains were discovered 2 months later by mushroom pickers. On May 5, 2001, Michel drove to Sedan, where he spotted 13-year-old Mananya Thampong. He had met her previously, having given her a lift home a few weeks before and gained her trust that way. He met her outside the library on this particular day and invited her back home to play with his son. Mananya agreed. She was known to be a sweet girl, the type any parent would be proud of having. She climbed into the back of Michel's van and he drove her to Nolevo, where he strangled her to death. Her remains were found 10 months later, having been almost completely eaten by wild animals. In June 2003, Michel would try to carry out another kidnapping and murder, but this would be the beginning of the end for him. He attempted to abduct a 13-year-old by asking her for directions to Mont de la Salle. The girl agreed and got inside the van. She would later tell officers that as soon as she was inside the van, Michel's demeanor changed and his smile became evil, according to her. He bound her hands and ankles with rope and asked her if she was a virgin. She was trapped, tied up in the back of the van, yet somehow she managed to chew through the binding and broke free. She jumped out of the back of the van and began to run down the road until she managed to flag down a passing car. But Michel was not about to let her go. He turned around. The girl had gotten inside the car that had stopped for her, and they drove onwards, passing Michel's vehicle along the way. The driver took down Michel's license plate and then drove to the police station where the 13-year-old reported the attempted abduction. When the police ran the plates through the system, Michel Fourniret's name came up. He was taken into custody, and thus an investigation began. Thank goodness, finally there's an end to this violent, disgusting rampage. On June 27, 2003, police began searching the Fourniret home using diggers and ground-penetrating technology. There, they discovered the horrific items inside the home. They found condoms, ropes, and mismatched children's clothes that did not belong to Salim, which signaled to them that something was very wrong. And Monique was present, but to officers, she appeared to be a submissive and obedient wife who just kept claiming that she did not realize what was stored in her own home. To authorities, she seemed unremarkable, a blank canvas of a woman who was possibly of lower intelligence than the average citizen. But they were wrong. Monique was fully capable of creating her own mask. Michel was taken into custody, and he refused to cooperate with authorities. And so they turned to Monique, certain that the demure housewife would give them the information that they needed. They thought she was under her husband's thumb and would be easy to break. But it took over 100 interviews between Michel and Monique before any information came to light. But as the year 2004 dawned and she was subjected to intense pressure, she finally broke. She admitted to 6 murders. After she confessed, the house of cards fell, and Michel confessed to killing 8 women and 1 unidentified man between 1988 and 2002. After the confession, Monique was arrested and the pair were extradited to France. In 2004, the pair also took authorities to the burial grounds of Elizabeth and Jean at the Château du Santal. When the bodies were uncovered, the prosecutor was present and standing beside Michel. As the excavator uncovered Elizabeth's body, the authorities looked on in horror. Michel reportedly turned to the prosecutor beside him and said, "It's so sad. It's awful." And then added, "Do you realize that when I strangled that little girl, she was the same age as your daughter is now?" So the trial took place between March 27th and 28th in 2008 in Charleville-Mézières. It was a media circus with over 400 journalists in attendance. Monique seemed particularly keen to have the women at the trial hear her side of the story, believing that they would empathize with what she had been through. But to the French public, this was a slap in the face. She did not want to be seen in the same light as Michel, but to many, her role was even more horrific. The prosecution was aiming for both to get the maximum sentence, and it was clear that Michel would likely get life in prison, but Monique's fate was not as certain. Without Michel, Monique may not have become a criminal. But without Monique, Michel never would have been able to abduct and murder as many girls as he did. As the trial began, throngs of people lined up outside the courthouse. The public hated Monique, as they believed her role was worse due to her gender and that she was a mother. Monique's defense tried to portray her as weak and afraid to get the public to sympathize with her as much as possible. But was she really a victim? On the first day of the trial, the room was packed and Monique was expressionless, looking all around her. She had dyed her hair blonde and cut it. She just looked ordinary, harmless, and old. Clearly, she'd been giving grooming advice to make herself look just as innocent as possible. She was slow to answer, often stammering, mumbling, and trembling. She didn't seem to fit the profile of a killer at all. But honestly, isn't that how their whole scheme worked? Michel, on the other hand, wanted a closed session with no photos. Even at his trial, he wished for control over the whole thing. But in her opening statement to the court, Monique said that she wanted to explain that she was actually a victim. Despite her testifying against him, Michel stated that he had threatened to kill Monique and Salim if she turned on him. Both he and Monique were painting her as the victim, but not everyone was convinced. On April 30th, the Mananya case was discussed. The horrifying topic of the couple's sex life was introduced. Monique stated that she would act like the victims, asking her husband to rape her. All the victims were made to beg. Monique and Michel would replay their crimes in their sex life, but it was not just for Michel's benefit. It pleased Monique to arouse him. These actions held perverse interest for Monique. She could have left or turned Michel in, but she didn't. In her own way, she also received gratification. On May 26th, the prosecution offered their closing speech. They requested life imprisonment with no parole for Michel and life imprisonment for Monique. They referred to Michel as a grotesque, grimacing clown, and Monique as a witch and a spider who had betrayed the cause of all mothers and wives. Monique's defense, represented by Richard Delgine, claimed that the hostility toward Monique almost absolved Michel of his crimes. On May 27th, the defense made their closing statements. As Delgine stood to speak, the families of the victims stood, placing a rose and a photo of the victims before the jury, and leaving the room in a silent act of defiance. They did not wish to hear why the monster deserved a defense. They felt Monique was the real mastermind. On May 28th, Michel was sentenced to life in prison with no parole after being convicted of 7 murders. Monique received a 28-year prison sentence with no parole. Both were also ordered to pay 1.5 million euro in moral compensation to the victim's family. Michel and Monique had been inactive for a period of roughly 10 years. However, they were at one point averaging 1 or 2 victims per year. Could the public really be expected to believe that they were able to resist their desires for that long? I mean, it seemed impossible. Logically, there was an estimation that the total number of victims was more along the lines of 35. And so with this in mind, the investigation picked up speed again. The only other person who knew the truth was Monique. She was the key to the other cases. But with nothing at stake, would she agree to participate? Monique insisted that she did not know if there were any murders in those 10 years. In May 2015, Monique's former prison mate contacted authorities. Monique had confided in her about the Estelle Mouzine case. The prison mate had seen Estelle's father pleading with the public on television for any information. She asked Monique if she knew anything about the case. Monique reportedly replied, "She's his type of child." referring to Michel's preferences. It was on January 9th, 2003, that Estelle left school at 6 p.m. and never returned home. She was only 9 years old, the youngest of all the victims. There was no evidence, no clues, no witnesses, but her parents believed she had been taken. Authorities conducted a 25-kilometer search around Guermantes, looking in wells, waterways, and forests, but they found nothing. In 2018, Michel confessed to the murder of Joanna Parrish and in 2020 of Estelle Mouzin. At the end of 2020, a reconstruction took place. Monique and Michel were escorted to the scene of the abduction. For the first time in years, the couple was reunited. Michel's memory was hazy, but through discussion with Monique, more information came out. At that point, Michel was showing signs of developing Alzheimer's, which could have contributed to his bad memory. Despite this, Michel admitted that he had killed Estelle, yet searches yielded no results. Despite digging through acres of forest, they did not find the body, and Estelle's fate remains a mystery. On May 10, 2021, Michel died at age 79 from heart problems after being hospitalized. And unfortunately, his secrets died with him. Estelle's remains were lost forever. The rest of the truth lays with Monique alone. But she didn't take part in everything. Eventually, she would go on to admit that she was present when Estelle was kidnapped. Michel left the home, and Monique watched over Estelle while he was at work. It was important to keep up the routine, she said, so that no one would suspect them. Although Monique claimed to know more information, others were skeptical that she was just simply using the opportunity to garner attention and was making up stories. In August of 2021, the searches for Estelle resumed at the Chateau. Monique traveled with authorities, leading them up a dense forest path, speaking as they moved. 18 years had passed since Estelle was kidnapped. Out in the open air, Monique was once again the center of attention. She reportedly took pleasure in leading the authorities as they relied on her for information. Once again, she got to manipulate someone. At the very end of the search, Monique suddenly told authorities that, they're in the wrong location altogether. It was as if Monique was playing a game and receiving satisfaction from the situation, even though nothing was at stake anymore. She felt like she got to be in control again. The cases of Joanna, Estelle, and Marie-Angélie Domesset, whose remains were also never found, were tried together in November 2023. In December, Monique was handed a second life sentence with a minimum of 20 years. Once again, the 3-week trial highlighted her role in reassuring the victims get into the van. Monique Olivier will be able to apply for constitutional release in 2032. Then, she will be 84 years old. What does Monique Olivier know, if she knows anything at all? Just how involved was she in the deaths and disappearances of all these young girls? And just how many more victims were involved? Monique was vilified in the media, rightfully for her role in the murders. However, it cannot be denied that there was a difference in the blame she took in comparison to her killer husband. Many have wondered about the son of these killers, Salim. In a recent hearing for Monique, he spoke to the court and to his mother via video while wearing an elaborate disguise of a wig, fake glasses, and a fake mustache. He shouted at Monique to reveal what she knew and told the court that he had no idea of the horrors his parents were committing, referring to them as actors who concealed their crimes from him for most of his life. After discovering his parents' real identities, Salim moved to southern France and assumed a new identity and a new life. But in a shocking twist, Salim was arrested in Nice in July 2023 for the alleged attempted rape of a minor. It's a horrifying conclusion to the legacy of cruelty, as he mirrors his own father's behavior. Police even questioned if there were more victims, as Salim allegedly operated with prowess and skill that only someone who'd committed the crime before could possess. Perhaps he had learned more from his parents than he was willing to admit. Unfortunately, the more information that comes out about killers in recent years, we realize that Monique Olivier and Michel Fourniret were not anomalies at all. Monsters walk among us, and they are far more common than anticipated. With the news of Salim's arrest, we must ask the question, are monsters born or created? And how many are out there waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike?